The storm drain had been singing all morning, which was what happened on Galveston Island when a Gulf squall pushed water through the old infrastructure faster than it was designed to move. And Darnell Cross had learned in 3 years of living here to read those sounds the way he had once read the acoustics of foreign cities, as information, not background. What he had not learned yet was what to do when the sound coming out of the drain had nothing to do with water. He was crossing the parking lot of the bait supply on Seawall Boulevard when he heard it beneath the storm noise, thin and intermittent, less a cry than a frequency his body recognized before his mind named it, and he stopped in the rain with his keys in his hand, the way a man stops when something important is happening, and he is not yet sure whether he is the person it is happening to. He was not a man who stopped easily. 15 years as a Navy SEAL had built into his nervous system a very efficient system for deciding what was relevant and what was not, and the thing in the drain was relevant. This is a story about what he found in that drain, and what it cost him, and what it gave him, and it is also a story about a sister he could not bury, and a guilt he had been keeping so carefully it had begun to feel like loyalty. If this story finds you tonight, tell us in the comments which city you are watching from, and subscribe before we go any further. Because what comes out of a storm drain in the rain sometimes changes more than just the day. Darnell Cross was 45 years old, and he had been living in a rented house 2 blocks off the seawall in Galveston for 3 years, which was the length of time it had taken him to understand that the ocean was the only thing loud enough to give his particular interior noise some competition. He was a large man, broad and deliberate in his movements. With close-cropped dark hair, a trimmed beard he kept neat more from habit than from vanity, and dark eyes that people consistently described as watchful, which was the polite version of what they actually meant, which was that he looked like someone who was always already thinking about the next thing. He had left the Navy 18 months after his medical retirement with a lumbar injury that had ended his operational capacity, a retirement portfolio that covered necessities, and a maritime security consulting business he operated from a laptop and a phone because it required very little of his body and quite a lot of his brain, and his brain had always been the part more difficult to keep occupied. He was good at the work and found it almost entirely insufficient, which was the arrangement he had made with his life for now. His younger sister, Adrian, had been 26 years old when she was killed in a drive-by shooting on a street in Beaumont, Texas, on a Tuesday night in May 3 years ago. She had been walking home from a night class at Lamar University. Working toward a nursing degree she had been pursuing part-time for 4 years, while also working a full-time shift job, and she had been in exactly the wrong place at a moment of someone else's violence that had nothing to do with her. Darnell had been deployed at the time, in a location he could not name in any documentation, and by the time the information traveled through the appropriate channels and reached him, and the appropriate arrangements were made for his emergency leave, Adrian's funeral was 4 days in the past. He had stood at her grave on a Thursday afternoon by himself, with no one from the family because they had already done this, and he had talked to her for about an hour in the way that soldiers learn to talk to the dead, directly and without performing it for anyone else. He had told her he was sorry. He had told her she deserved better. He had told her he was going to be fine because he understood that this was what she would have insisted on, and the lie of it had not gotten smaller in the 3 years since. His parents were still in Beaumont, his mother working the same administrative job she had worked for 20 years. His father recently retired from the shipyard, and Darnell called them every Sunday without fail and drove the hour and a half to see them on most holidays, and none of them ever talked about Adrian for more than a few minutes because it was still the kind of loss that buckled the room when you gave it too much. The puppy in the storm drain was a Catahoula leopard mix, approximately 6 weeks old, merle-patterned with a blue eye and a brown eye, and the specific expression of an animal that has been in a very bad situation long enough to have opinions about it. She was wedged into the concrete lip of the drain opening, soaked through, trembling, with a cut on one haunch, from something metal that had caught her at some point in her transit through the system, and she was making the sound that had stopped Darnell in the rain with his keys in his hand, a sustained note of exhausted protest that was somewhere between complaint and demand. He got her out with one hand, a maneuver requiring the kind of precise spatial assessment that had once served him in rooms in other countries, and she did not bite him, which he took as a sign of either good character or depleted energy, and held her inside his jacket the way a man holds something he does not intend to drop, and drove her to the emergency veterinary clinic on Broadway without making a decision about it, because decisions required pausing, and pausing was not currently available. The vet tech at the clinic was a young woman named Carmen, who had the calm efficiency of someone who had seen everything and was unimpressed by none of it. And she cleaned the cut and ran fluids and told Darnell the puppy would be fine, physically, with attention, and asked if he was keeping her. He said he did not know. She handed the puppy back to him, wrapped in a small towel, and said that was fair and that he could bring her back for a checkup in a week. And the puppy looked up at him from the towel with her mismatched eyes, and he understood, in the way that you understand certain things that arrive complete, without needing to be reasoned toward, that the answer was yes. He named her Beau, which was short for Beaumont, and which he did not explain to anyone. She was the color of a storm cloud patched with old copper, with a tail that seemed to operate on a separate enthusiasm budget from the rest of her body. And she learned his house in 2 days and his routines in 4 and his mood in approximately a week, with a speed that suggested she had been paying very close attention and taking notes. She did not have the composed stillness of a trained working dog. She was a puppy, and therefore governed by impulse and curiosity, and an apparently inexhaustible interest in everything below knee height. But she had a quality that Darnell noticed and could not immediately name, which was that she was always aware of where he was in a room, even when she appeared to be entirely focused on something else. And when his mood changed, which it did in ways he tried to keep internal and mostly failed, she would cross the room without apparent reason and sit on his foot, not on the floor near his foot, but directly on top of it, as if anchoring him was a task that required physical contact to be properly executed. Emmett Broussard lived 4 houses down on the same street and had been a shrimp fisherman out of Galveston for 40 years before his knees made that impossible, and was now 76 and spent most of his days on his porch with a coffee and a radio tuned to the weather service, and the particular territorial alertness of a man who considers the street in front of his house to be a form of property. He was Cajun by origin, small and weathered as driftwood, with white hair and a gray mustache, and a voice that had the bayou in it even after 40 years of Gulf Coast living. He had noticed Darnell the week he moved in and had filed a preliminary assessment that he did not share because Emmett Broussard considered most things worth knowing before saying. When Beau came into the picture, Emmett revised his assessment upward slightly because in his experience, a man who rescues a dog from a storm drain is usually worth talking to, and he walked down the street the following Saturday with a container of shrimp étouffée and knocked on the door without particular ceremony. The two of them fell into the kind of friendship that happens between two people who have each lost a great deal and have stopped performing recovery for other people's benefit. They ate Emmett's food on the porch most Saturday mornings, with Beau between them investigating everything reachable, and they talked about practical things, boat mechanics, weather patterns, the specific failures of the Galveston seawall in various historical storms, because practical things were a way of being in each other's company, without requiring the other person to be fine. Emmett had lost a son to a fishing accident 11 years earlier, and had the quality of a man who has absorbed that into his structure rather than around it, and Darnell found this more useful than most of what he had encountered in the way of grief management. The old man never told him to move on, or to find closure, or to be grateful for what remained, because Emmett had been told all of those things after his son died and had found all of them to be true in ways that were also entirely beside the point. In February, 4 months after Darnell found Beau in the drain, a developer named Paul Whitfield applied for a permit to convert a block of older housing on the west end of the island into a vacation rental complex, and one of the properties on the block was a small animal rescue operation called Galveston Second Chance that had been running out of a converted house for 7 years, operated by a woman named Rosa Leal, who had placed over 400 animals in that time with no city funding and no significant attention from anyone outside of the rescue community. The permit, if approved, would require Rosa to vacate within 90 days. Rosa had no legal team and no money for one, and had submitted a 1-page objection to the city planning office that had not yet been acknowledged. Emmett found out about it through a neighbor and told Darnell on a Saturday morning with the quiet directness of a man delivering information he expects to be acted on. Darnell had not intended to get involved in a city permitting dispute. His skill set was in maritime security, not land use law, and he had no particular history of civic engagement that he was aware of. What he had was a phone, a lawyer he had worked with on a contract matter who turned out to know a land use attorney in Houston, and a former SEAL teammate named Andre who had gone to law school after his own medical retirement and owed Darnell a professional favor of some years' standing. He also had Bo, who had come from a drain and not from a shelter, and who was therefore not the product of Rosa's work, but was the product of the same world Rosa's work was trying to address. And something about that felt relevant. The three of them, Darnell, Emmett, and Rosa, met at Emmett's kitchen table on a Tuesday evening. And what came out of that meeting was a letter of objection substantially more detailed than Rosa's original one, a public comment filing, and the beginning of a coalition that eventually included a neighborhood association, a local veterinarian, 2 city council members who had quietly supported Rosa's work for years, and a retired judge who had adopted 2 of Rosa's dogs and had opinions about the situation. The developer's permit was modified substantially after 2 planning board hearings, reducing the scope of the project and excluding the block containing Rosa's house from the conversion zone. None of this brought Adrian back, and Darnell had not expected it to. What it did was give him something that his consulting work had not provided and the ocean had only partially substituted for, which was a problem that existed in the physical world and required him to show up for. He drove to Beaumont in April and took Bo with him, and she spent the afternoon on his mother's back porch, completely indifferent to the gravity of the occasion, systematically investigating a flower bed his mother had planted the spring before Adrian died. His father sat in the yard in a lawn chair and watched Bo with the expression of a man who is watching something run out of fuel and finding it unexpectedly enjoyable. Nobody brought up Adrian until late in the afternoon, and then Darnell's mother said her name in the middle of a sentence about something ordinary, the way you say a name when it belongs in the sentence and not as an event, and Darnell said it back, and neither of them made anything of it. And that was the first time since the grave on the Thursday afternoon that the name had been in the air between them and not required anyone to brace for what came after. Sometimes the smallest thing opens the largest door, not because the thing is magical, but because you have spent enough time near the door that your hands finally remember how. A storm drain in the rain is not an auspicious beginning for anything. What it is, sometimes, is an opening, the kind that does not look like much from the outside, and turns out to be the only way in. Darnell Cross went to the bait supply for supplies and came back with a merle-coated puppy with mismatched eyes and a name that meant something only to him. And what followed was not a transformation or a revelation, but a series of small, specific Tuesday evenings in a rescue house on the west end of an island, and Saturdays on a porch with an old fisherman's étouffée, and one afternoon in Beaumont when his mother said a name out loud and the sky did not fall. If this story found you tonight, share it with someone who needs a reminder that what comes out of the worst situations is sometimes the thing that opens everything else. Tell us in the comments which moment moved you most and which city you are watching from, and if you can, support an animal rescue near you, the small ones especially, the ones running out of houses with no funding and 400 animals placed, because they are doing something the world needs more of than it is paying for. Subscribe to this channel and we will keep finding these stories.